Here we are again talking about how the Cold War hardens. It is opposed 1950 to 1956, um, following from the outline that I distributed with that title. So I handled the last few topics last time. I had handled the first few topics, excuse me, last time. Talked about the panic in the United States, the discussion about whether to build hydrogen weapons, the question of bombers versus missiles, McCarthyism, we talked about that, the Korean War, responses to Korea, this oddity that the United States in effect mobilized the whole Cold War militarily while the Korean War was going. So it wasn't just a question of fighting that war, but organizing the whole world to support the Cold War as a kind of backup. Then we talked about the return of the right with Churchill in 1951, and then with Eisenhower elected at the end of 1952 and taking office at the beginning of 1953. Now they bring in the new look, a national security strategy that is organized around the idea of nuclear weapons as the primary thing. And it fits in beautifully with the perspectives of the other NATO partners in Europe, because the Lisbon Force Goals of 1952, which suggested that they should have 41 divisions and raise 41 divisions of conventional troops, very expensive proposition. That whole thing fell apart entirely, and none of them put up the money for that. And so they all decided they would depend on nuclear weapons for their presumed defense against presumed Soviet attack. And the United States, of course, would be the one who would have the nuclear weapons. So that's the shape of NATO. That shaped up in about 1952, 53, right? And that's pretty much the shape of NATO today. If you, through all the transmogrifications it's gone through, at least on that matter, it is a nuclear alliance dependent on US nuclear weapons, and really dependent on these more than an actual ability to defend Europe with conventional forces. Although this changes constantly, and there are all kinds of new perspectives introduced every year. Nevertheless, I think that we have still not broken entirely with that mold that was set in 1952 and 3. Anyhow, we're talking about all these things last time, and I guess we finished up talking about the death of Stalin and the succession to Stalin, the rise of Nikita Khrushchev. And we gave an indication of some of the things they're going to be arguing over, and we'll talk a lot more about Khrushchev before we're through. We'll come back and talk about the Soviet succession struggle and Soviet evolution of Soviet ideas. And we'll talk more about it today, and a whole lot more about it next time, the time after. So we've only really introduced that problem of the Soviets and their politics and the changes that they are going through. But today we have to talk about Southeast Asia, because right after the defeat of Korea, it became apparent that the United States was not going to slip out of Asia, but it still had the whole question of Indochina to take into consideration. So we need some reorientation. We have to reorient ourselves around things. We've been talking about Korea as a special problem, the Chinese revolution and how it develops into the Korean War, and then the United States response to that. We've been talking about all those things, but we haven't said much about Indochina. And I think it's worthwhile for us to remind ourselves that this whole perspective on struggle against communism in Indochina, or I should say in Southeast Asia, it all goes back to Mountbatten and the Southeast Asia Command at the end of World War II. Remember us discussing that when we talked about Mountbatten, Stilwell, Claire Chennault, Chiang Kai-shek, all these controversies about how to fight the war and all the rest of that. And you no doubt remember my mentioning Mountbatten in that regard, and saying that Mountbatten was very much interested in conducting a campaign to save imperialism, I think you'd have to say, save imperialism in Southeast Asia. Here you see imperialism as it would have existed before World War I. You get the basic outlines of the actors. Well, not all of the actors. We don't see the German colonies on this map, but we do see the French in Indochina, Thailand, Siam, that is no man's land. That is to say, Siam is not a colony. The British and the French have come to terms over Siam. They're going to leave it alone. The British are going to have Burma as part of India, and the French are going to have Indochina. So Siam is there. Thailand, it's going to be Thailand. And eventually it will be allied with the Japanese, as you perhaps already know, in World War II. The French are trying to hang on to Indochina at the end of World War II, and Mountbatten becomes the agent of that. So he's using a lot of forces. He's using captured Japanese troops. He's using thousands of troops from India, from the Indian Army. So the British are good at this kind of thing. These are not a lot of British troops that are actually carrying this thing out. And they are working to establish the French back in Indochina. They managed to do so by 1945. They are similarly pursuing a rather long-range strategy, which I think is worthwhile for us to keep in mind. A long-range strategy which depends on the idea that the British are going to try to get their hands back on Hong Kong. They're going to try to get Singapore back, if possible. Going to try to keep Malaya from becoming independent. And when you talk about Malaya, you're talking about the British possessions also in North Borneo. The British think about Malaya and North Borneo as all their sphere of influence there. And they're going to eventually try to make a state out of all of that called Malaysia. They want Singapore and Hong Kong, of course. And they're also working to establish the Dutch in Indonesia. We already talked about that. How the Indonesian independence movement was fought arms in hand, almost right from the beginning, by Mountbatten and by all of these British Empire, you could say, plus Japanese troops that they were fighting in Southeast in the Dutch East Indies, soon to become Indonesia, but fighting against this Indonesian independence movement. So imperialism trying to establish itself in Southeast Asia at the end of World War II. So while the United States is agonizing over the Chinese Revolution and the Korean War, the French continue to fight in Indochina, and they'll be carrying on this struggle between 1946 and 1954. It won't be driven out until 1954. So the United States leaves Korea in 1953, and then immediately Indochina starts to loom on the horizon. The United States have been giving guarantees to the French about Indochina since 1946 or so. Harry Truman once again takes the view that he's got to fight communism and that it is secondary to fight against colonialism. And if anything, what that adds up to, as we've been saying, is that you are supporting colonialism against communism. You have reversed the signs. You're no longer, as Roosevelt had in mind, you're no longer going to go along with independence movements and press decolonization upon the Western powers. Now you're taking the view you're going to defend these Western powers, defend imperialism, and you're going to fight against decolonization under the rubric of anti-communism. So that's fundamental motif of the Cold War in Southeast Asia, and it probably behooves us to keep that in mind as we proceed through the topic. Okay, so what's the problem with Vietnam? It's the French and the French Foreign Legion. They can't raise any real troops out of the French army, anything much from the French army. They have their own generals commanding it, but they're essentially using the Foreign Legion to fight in Indochina and having a rather hard time of it. And finally they get the view they're going to try and bring these guerrillas out of the jungle British, by the way, during the same period, British were doing splendidly in their anti-guerrilla, anti-communist operations in Malaya. So the French were lagging behind in a certain sense in that respect. But the French wanted to get set-piece battles to fight the Viet Minh, and they arrived in the end at a strategy of fortifying one area and hoping that the Viet Minh would come out into the open and give battle in a conventional way, not in a guerrilla sense of hide and run, but in a conventional way, come out and try to take a big position away from them. Those of you who remember World War I and Verdun will be reminded of something of this strategy pursued toward the Germans, and an analogy with this strategy pursued toward the Germans. So Dien Bien Phu turned out to be the place where they hoped they would annihilate the Viet Minh forces. Dien Bien Phu is down in a valley and has mountains on all sides of it. The British base was down in the valley where they could land planes. It's basically an airstrip plus hospital plus other buildings. And so they built a tremendous armed perimeter around it and fortified it, flew in all sorts of weapons, equipment, supplies, and all the rest of that, extra troops. They were really going to make a stand there, and hopefully they would annihilate the Viet Minh forces. The Viet Minh forces did not give them battle, but dug in the hillsides and had to perform colossal feats of dragging artillery through this inhospitable terrain in order to set up a whole lot of guns in these hillsides. And eventually they managed to do it. So the Dien Bien Phu battle is basically an artillery duel in which one side has got the artillery and the other side doesn't. So the Viet Minh set up in all of these hillsides, pounding away at the French positions below. So this went on for several months, and they really pounded down the French, demoralized them something fierce, and really in effect had them completely defeated before they actually marched the infantry in to take Dien Bien Phu. But it's a terrible, terrible, agonizing, demoralizing defeat for the French and for French imperialism. May of 1954. So Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader of the anti-French guerrillas, Ho Chi Minh presumably would have got all of Indochina at his disposal. I mean, he's defeated the French army, and if the situation on the ground is any indication of how the peace settlement ought to be made, you would have thought that Ho Chi Minh would emerge as the president of this new post-French Indochina. But this was not the case. This was not the case because there had to be an international meeting. And at this international meeting to arrange the settlement, all the great powers were going to be involved. So the United States was going to be there, and British and the French, and the Soviets were going to play a role in it, and the Chinese too. They'd been supplying Ho Chi Minh. So the strategies of the peace treaty had to, in effect, be worked out in coordination with the big powers. So we've seen that a lot in diplomatic history, where a war happens, and when it ends, the peace conference brings in all of the powers who are associated with the war, or who think they have an interest in the war, or just think that by virtue of being great powers, they should be consulted on a matter of such importance. So that's what we have at the Geneva Conference in 1954 at the end of this war. And the result of it was that the Vietnamese guerrillas, the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh, did not get all of Indochina under their control. And the reason for that was the politics of the other powers. Now, what was going on at the same time was that the United States was carrying out a campaign in Europe in order to try to organize all the European powers. indicated, talking about um, um, the Lisbon goals, the Lisbon Force goals, try to organize them in a conventional way to get them to supply some troops. That turned out to be uh, impossible of accomplishment, but in the course of that campaign, there arose a British plan put forward by a French plan put forward by the French politician René Plavon. The Plavon plan was to form a European Defense Community, an EDC. And this EDC would have included German troops, this defense community. They would have organized German battalions under German leadership and command, but not at beyond the battalion level. So when you get up to the command of all the forces, the Germans wouldn't have had a role there. So it's a way of getting the Germans to participate and not putting them in a position of being able to either lead the EDC or take an independent role within the EDC. Now, on the one hand, you can say that that was a brilliant thing in order to get the troops for a genuine NATO defense in Europe. But on the other, there were many who said that this was a way that German rearmament was being slipped under the door, that in the guise of defense of NATO, we were going to get a revival of German militarism. So that idea was always very sharply put in the press. Now, you already can understand the communist position on this and Soviet position on this. We're going to raise a tremendous propaganda effort talking about German rearmament as a revival of German militarism, of course. But most of this, I would contend, is quite genuine. The Soviets are genuinely afraid of a revival of Germany. They're especially looking down the road. They know that German rearmament means that the next thing that's going to be brought up is should there be German nuclear weapons. So that's something on the mind of the Soviets. We'll talk more about that next time when we discuss the Soviet aid to the Chinese nuclear program and the Soviet worries that the United States would have corresponding aid to a German nuclear program under Konrad Adenauer. Adenauer, who led Germany at that time, was very keen to make Germany a completely revived great power, and to him that would also have meant also nuclear weapons. So that issue is not completely introduced with the Plavon plan, but many thought that the idea had been suggested and that there was a certain logic once you said A, as the Germans like to say. Once you say A, you have to say B. So this is the British liberal cartoonist David Lowe, who we followed for some of his other cartoons on other issues, and who I followed in my course on the 20s and the 30s. And he is essentially illustrating this idea that while there's cheering for the German rearmament under the EDC, there's also the specter, the ghost, the threat of an uncontrolled German rearmament. So this EDC was pending, and the French had to think about that. And there was the question of how peace would be organized in Indochina, operating at the same time that the EDC was reaching a kind of, well, it was going to be discussed and voted on in the French Parliament. So the view of the communists was that they had to stop this thing, and they wanted to stop it. They knew the Gaullist deputies probably were against it, and maybe could be induced to vote together with the communists, Gaullist deputies and communist deputies in the French Parliament, voting against this EDC, if there were a certain bargain, if perhaps Ho Chi Minh in Indochina didn't have such a complete victory as it seemed that he would have been justified in claiming. So they would restrain, the communist powers, and this would be Mayankov primarily leading the Soviets in the spring of 1954, Mayankov and Molotov together, that they would restrain Ho Chi Minh, tell him, don't take all of Indochina, settle yourself with, be settled with, be satisfied with ruling in North Vietnam and turn over South Vietnam to a different status establish a transition period for the absorption of South Vietnam into North Vietnam, schedule elections. You know Ho Chi Minh will probably win these elections, and placate the French. And in return, the French will do us Soviets a favor by voting against the EDC. We Soviets don't like German rearmament. It's a complicated bargain. International politics is a little bit like that sometimes, especially at the end of wars. This is our explanation for why Ho Chi Minh did not get all of Indochina and had to settle himself, had to be satisfied only with, at least for the moment, only with North Vietnam. Or as some American officials put it, why Ho Chi Minh didn't get all of Vietnam in one bite, how he had agreed and settled for the idea of getting it in two bites. Well, the deal really worked. And when the EDC came up in the French Assembly, the Gaullists voted against it, so the communists, it failed. So no EDC. That whole thing might have worked. No unified Vietnam or unified Indochina under Ho Chi Minh, no German participation in the EDC in the West as a balance, as a price for that. And that bargain would have worked, except for the United States, John Foster Dulles got up on his hind legs and said, if the EDC failed, he would have to make what he called an agonizing reappraisal. So this he announced in the summer of 1954, an agonizing reappraisal of all the relationships that existed. These would include NATO and everything else. So this is really just a kind of generalized threat. Nobody exactly knew what it meant, but it's the kind of thing you have to take seriously because the United States is a prime mover in all of these military and political arrangements. So if the United States is so adamantly dissatisfied with everything, you have to step back from it. So it looked like there was going to be a terrible, terrible impasse, but the British stepped in. And they said that the Dunkirk Pact, which they had arrived at in 1946, a pact between England and France, could be used to form a broader organization. At first, the West European Union, and then bring Germany somehow into the West European Union, so the German rearmament would be accomplished through that route, with the British, for the most part, as sponsors. The Germans would have to promise they'd never have nuclear weapons. And they did make that promise. And they had to say that they'd put up with reinforcement of the British troops in the north of Germany. So the British have a zone north of Germany, and so part of the arrangement is that the British are going to more or less augment their troops in order to keep a closer eye on this whole question of German rearmament. So it's a way of slowing down, taming, domesticating the idea of German rearmament, but getting it anyhow. So very complicated process we have to take note of and interpret in 1954 and 55, whereby the Germans get rearmed and start raising big battalions. So they're going to have a lot of troops participating in NATO. They'll be in every exercise. German defense industry be building a lot of tanks and artillery and all sorts of military implements. Good stuff. You know, Germans are good at that sort of thing, and that all is going to take shape. Moreover, the United States and Britain, or I should say Britain, start the sentence out that way. The British patched up their relationship with the United States to a much greater degree because they performed this very tricky diplomatic task. So here we get this theme of the British, leading the United States diplomatically every step. They're the leading voice in starting the Cold War in the first place, we could even say, in 1946, Winston Churchill's Fulton, Missouri speech. We could also say that the British, took a lead with NATO at the time of the Berlin blockade. Certainly true. Taking a lead now with German rearmament. The British, they seem to be the leading diplomatic edge in the Cold War, but the United States providing the main force. And not to say the United States is dragged around by the nose. No, this is all happening because John Foster Dulles insisted that the whole question of German rearmament not be buried with the failure of the EDC. So that's an interesting thing that shapes up, and a kind of world politics, you could say, of the Cold War. You know, the relationship between power questions in Asia and power questions in Europe, and how intimately they're tied. We've run into this, I think, on a number of occasions in the past. How the French feel about all this, seeing Germany rearmed. The French did not like this idea, have a hard time swallowing it. How did they come to grips with it? What was their response? Well, response, let's put some money into building nuclear weapons. So we've seen this, I don't know how many times now. You know, that is the problem, and we will see it over and over again. This phenomenon of you know, big diplomatic or military defeat. You don't know how to swallow it. The only response you can give is to build more weapons, and in this case, to really contribute in a big way to the French nuclear program. Well, you might say the French nuclear program is not interesting to us because they're never going to have a lot of nuclear weapons compared to the Soviet Union and the United States, but any nuclear weapons are important. The French take the view that if the British are going to have nuclear weapons, and remember they do, that the French ought to have them as well. And they even use the same argument for justifying these nuclear weapons. The British say that in a crisis when the Soviet Union is threatening Europe, by the way, it's always against the Soviet Union that you have to justify the possession of nuclear weapons. So if the Soviet Union is threatening West Europe, they will have to think twice if they have to confront a decision to be made in Washington on the one hand and also in London. So that was the argument of the British. And the French end up making an argument just like that. If they have to think twice, they'll have to think 3 times about a decision made in Washington, in London, and in Paris. So if the French have nuclear weapons, in addition to the Americans and the British, they will add to the deterrence. I mean, that's an argument that is designed to be consumed, of course, in the United States. That's who they mainly have to justify it to. And the nuclear weapons program is going to get started, but it's not going to be driven to a finish right away. And in fact, it hits a few snags from this point on. It doesn't really exactly get going. It's just a statement of intent, basically, made by the French Parliament. But it'll happen again right after Suez, and that's going to be another defeat for the French. We'll finish up talking about that today. After Suez, the French will make a second decision to put more effort into nuclear weapons. And finally, they'll have the things in the 60s. The force de frappe, strike force. We'll talk a lot about that. We'll talk about General de Gaulle, who's going to return to power by then. And he's going to have to set right all of these humiliations, if that is possible, is thinkable, going to have to set right all these humiliations that the French are suffering. So there it is. And then what happened immediately after that, the Soviets decided that they would organize all their client states into a pact just like NATO. And they did in 1955, the Warsaw Pact. Frequently you see in the histories that NATO was put into shape, and then the Warsaw Pact was put into shape. So the Warsaw Pact is an answer to NATO. No, not so. NATO was shaping up by 1949. The Warsaw Pact doesn't happen until 1955. That's a big gap there. The real reason for the Warsaw Pact is not the formation of NATO. It's the rearmament of Germany. So it reinforces this thought that the Soviets are really quite keen, quite interested in the threat posed by German weapons, German rearmament, German militarism, and God forbid for them, they would say, German nuclear weapons. So I'm going to be coming back to this theme and talking about all of its ramifications shortly, but not today. We'll come back to this theme when we get to talking about the Sino-Soviet split and real reasons for it. And just as so as not to be mysterious, let me indicate now that I'm going to argue that the Sino-Soviet split is mainly over nuclear weapons. It's not over any other ideological questions or any other such things. So the French then turned to nuclear weapons at the end of this crisis over the EDC. Are they out of the woods? Are they going to suffer any further indignities? No. The answer is no. The indignities are going to keep coming for French imperialism. Next revolution on the agenda is Algeria. Algeria was not really boiling up until this point, but immediately after the defeat in Indochina, after Dien Bien Phu, Algeria starts to come up very strongly. This is going to be much more intense in the minds of the French, this desire to save Algeria, to keep Algeria from, it's almost like the United States losing Texas or California or something like that for the French. They want to hang on to Algeria. We'll talk about that next time and how Algeria figures in all of these things. So the Warsaw Pact then. So after 1955, we have Europe pretty much divided east-west into military pacts facing each other hostily and presumably, ready to square off. You note in this map that Yugoslavia is in green. Yugoslavia is a communist country, but it is neutral. It is neutral. You could say that's a genuine neutrality because we have some other neutrals on this map. We have Austria that was made neutral in 1955. We have Switzerland that was neutral already. Of course, the Irish don't participate in any kind of military arrangements together with the British, so they're neutral. Sweden, Finland, we have neutrals in Europe, but Yugoslavia is a special kind of neutral because Yugoslavia is still a revolutionary power. It still calls itself a communist regime, Marxist regime. They want to hook up with the other revolutionary forces in the world. They will be doing so. And this provides us with some of our problems that need to be discussed. But before we drop the subject of Southeast Asia, let's consider what the United States did at the end of this thing. While remember, Ho Chi Minh has taken half a loaf. He's ensconced in North Vietnam, and there are going to be elections in South Vietnam. The United States didn't sign the Geneva Agreement, so the door's open to the United States subverting the whole thing and building up South Vietnam. And it's going to do exactly that. And in fact, it's fishing around during this period we're talking about. It's fishing around in the United States. Finally, in a Catholic monastery in the United States, it will find No Dinh Diem, and it will make him into the leader of South Vietnam, and it will send American troops there to support him. And the great American war over Vietnam will take shape in earnest from this point on. But the immediate response of this thing was to form a NATO-like military alliance for Southeast Asia. That's what Dulles wanted, some kind of containment instrument, a military alliance. So that's what they formed in '54, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO. So that's Britain, France, United States. So far I haven't named a Southeast Asian country, have I? Well, Australia, New Zealand. So far I haven't named a non-white Asian country, but there are a couple. Pakistan, well, that's not very close to Southeast Asia. Let's look further. Pakistan, there's Thailand and the Philippines. Well, so there is some Southeast Asian participation in SEATO. So the way I just described it is the way many looked at it. There's not much to the SEATO alliance in Southeast Asia. It's all outsiders in Southeast Asia. The enemies of it, communists, can easily make the argument that it's mainly an imperialist or ex-imperialist kind of system. And what are the Pakistanis doing in it? It's not so easy to understand. Where's the Pakistani interest? in these affairs. And the Pakistani are going to be involved in this. They're going to be involved, of course, in the other programs in the Mideast. They're not directly hooked into either of those problems, but they will get all sorts of support for the United States. They'll get aid. They'll get military weapons. The main thing that they want weapons and want power for is to oppose India. So they'll get that as a result of participating in these pacts. But it's hard to say Pakistan has a real, how to put it, a real stake in the Cold War, defined in any kind of serious way. But anyhow, the Pakistanis will be participating. And Dulles is putting together a structure of containment with Tito. And the next step provided for by the British. Oh, before I talked about the British, let me give an indication of this famous idea of a domino theory, that you couldn't allow South Vietnam to go communist because it would set off a whole series of communist revolutions, and they would be like dominoes falling. And these dominoes would represent the real threat. It's not so much losing to the communists in South Vietnam, it came to be argued in the 1960s, but it's the effect of it. It's the dominoes. So it's the domino theory, and quite a few people made speeches about it. President Eisenhower said that they'd fall like dominoes. And often it was argued in other circles, sometimes argued in terms of economic competition between India and China. It was said India's got a free system and China's got a communist system. Whichever one looks the best to the countries in between India and China, it often used to be said, is going to go the way of the one that looks better, the one that produces better. And so this was a domino theory, a domino idea. But the domino idea that you see illustrated in this cartoon is the British idea of a domino idea. So Korea is already falling. Perhaps Korea is going to make Vietnam fall, and then Vietnam will make Thailand, and the next thing you know, it'll be Malaysia and Singapore. So these are all British interests, right? Former British interests and present British interests. Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. So it isn't just the question of the countries between China and India in this domino theory. It's a question of the dominoes rolling into the Southern Pacific and into Indonesia. This, I think, is the way the British thought of the matter. These are British dominoes, I think, because the British want to set up some kind of a state around Singapore, fighting like demons to defeat the communists in Malaya, and a lot of their lessons will be absorbed and taken very seriously by the Americans in giving advice to their own troops in Vietnam. So that is the domino theory there. But the other part of Dulles's containment scheme is put together by the British, the Baghdad Pact, which they organized in 1955. So here you see the participating countries. Once again, Pakistan has got into this thing. Turkey and Persia, Turkey and Iran, that is to say. Iraq, so the British are very much interested in Iraqi oil and very much interested in Iranian oil after the overthrow, as we talked about it last time, of Mossadegh in 1953. So the British want to set up this tier of states. And the argument is, of course, that it's a wall, which is a barrier to Soviet expansion into the Middle East, but really it's a series of arrangements which can satisfy British interests and then, of course, Western interests in general, the United States interests in general. So the Baghdad Pact was put together in 1955. Egypt, they would have liked as part of it. If they had Egypt, it would have been a very, you might say, almost dominant force in the Middle East, and maybe it could have been used against Israel. Hard to figure that, but maybe it could have. At any rate, if they had Egypt, it would be a considerable force. But Nasser, for the Egyptians, would not hear of it, would not join the would not join the Baghdad Pact, defied it, and said he was against Pactomania. Um, so he's a thorn in the side of John Foster Dulles and the idea of forming containment pacts, Pactomania, all around the world. NATO, CENTO, CETO, etc. They'll be. So Dulles, I should say, Nasser stood up very strongly against this thing. The Soviets liked that. So the Soviets made a deal with him when they found out he was denouncing the Baghdad Pact. They made a deal for some weapons and sent them from the Skoda Ironworks, Skoda Arms Works in Bohemia, in Czechoslovakia. And so they will send these weapons, and they include a lot of Soviet equipment too. So there are a lot of small arms, a lot of tanks, Soviet bombers, in fact, bombers capable of bombing Israel, all sent to Nasser in 1955. Czech arms deal. So that caused Nasser to look upon the Soviet bloc in a very friendly way, recognize China right after the Czech arms deal. So this arrangement was starting to be put together, a kind of a counter NATO, if you will, or kind of a revolt in a certain sense, kind of a revolt against the Baghdad Pact and against the Dulles conception of containment. And so there's a map that shows the whole containment idea in the 50s, the way the United States had hoped it would shape up. You see it's a ring around. It's very, very similar to the conceptions of the British Empire in the 19th century. India is not part of it. That's a big hole in it. So the Indians are very favorable to the Soviet, very friendly, they even see the Soviet Union as an economic model for India. So they're friendly to the Soviets. They're not going to be part of any of this pact making. And as you see, there are serious holes in the thing, but it's still pretty formidable. I mean, it's got all of Western Europe. As long as it's got something in the Middle East, can hook up there. Greece and Turkey have been dragooned into it. So it's hard to imagine Greece and Turkey getting along on anything up to this time. And in the time that we are currently, I mean, that's to say the present time, Greece and Turkey look at each other in a very hostile way over gas and natural resources in the Eastern Mediterranean off Cyprus. I don't know if they're going to fight a war over it, but making very nasty kinds of noises to each other, these NATO allies. But in those days, it was considered quite a feat to get Greece and Turkey together. They're not exactly, traditional friends, to put it mildly. So there's the NATO, I should say the containment structure as it exists. I think a pretty rickety thing on the whole. It's a lot less strong than it seems. Very strong in Europe. Rather weak in the Middle East. We'll see it in rags in the Middle East shortly. And of course, never worth a hoot in Southeast Asia. Terrible tragedy for the United States to have defended containment in the way it did in Southeast Asia. And that's going to entail a general tragedy for the United States, and a tragedy with all sorts of ramifications, which we can't even hint at today, but we'll be getting into them in the last part of this course. But that's the whole conception, containment. Now, was there anything against containment? The answer to that is yes. There was a bloc of independent, anti-imperialist minded, bumptious, and thinking of themselves as kind of national revolutionaries, states of that sort. So these include Indonesia, India, Burma, and you might include a number of others. You might put them in the same category even with revolutionary China. And maybe Nasser's Egypt and other countries, other Arab states might think of themselves. It's the revolutionary, anti-imperialist, third world nationalism, that idea that has a very powerful showing in 1955. And it's a response, I think, to all this pact building by John Foster Dulles, this containment building. And the argument is we are not for the Cold War. We think the main antagonism in world politics is not between East and West in the Cold War. It is between the Western imperialists and revolutionary third world nationalism. Okay, so these are two different conceptions for organizing your thinking about the rivalries in the world. I'm going to argue that the first one, Cold War conception of the battle between East and West, is going to fall apart completely. And that second one, that Bandung conception, is going to win the day in the 1960s. It's going to win the American students, going to win all the opponents of the Vietnam War. Not that that's inherent or anything like that, but I think it's the events that drove the thing to that logical conclusion. So there's the grouping at Bandung. It has all sorts of brilliant personalities. Right? So these people are going to be talked about all over the world now. And they're not exactly statesmen leading great powers. Well, they sort of are. They're middle rank powers, or maybe something below middle rank powers, if you consider the British and the French middle rank powers. I haven't got a nuclear power among them. But these are kind of important states, states with a regional importance, certainly states that have a revolutionary message, and that's going to be the big thing with third world nationalism, this revolutionary message, which isn't exactly the same thing as military power, but it's still rather strong. So here you have the big personalities from left to right, Nehru from India, Kwame Nkrumah, from the Gold Coast, soon to be called Ghana when it was independent in 1960. Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt, and on his left, Sukarno of Indonesia, and over in the far right, there's Tito of Yugoslavia. So Yugoslavia is involved with third world nationalism. Isn't that interesting? So by virtue of its communism. It is interested ideologically in third world nationalism. So these are very powerful personalities. The Chinese come to Bandung, make all kinds of anti-imperialist and revolutionary speeches. They get a very friendly welcome. The Chinese are definitely part of this whole thing, one way or another. Maybe they're not the leading part. The Chinese don't bother to become the leading part of it, but they're definitely hooked up with this thing. And you can imagine it represents, with China, represents quite a block of countries. There's Nasser shaking hands with Nehru of Egypt and Tito standing over them, smiling. Everybody's smiling, everybody on good terms. Nehru with Ho Chi Minh, who just won the struggle for Vietnamese, or at any rate, he won the first chapter of the struggle for Vietnamese independence. And so they're on pretty friendly terms. And Khrushchev himself in the Soviet Union came to the conclusion that this was a really dynamic force in world politics. That Soviet Union is a revolutionary communist power, and to be able to hook up with all of these forces in world politics would be an enormous step forward for the Soviet cause for communism. So Khrushchev now, who comes to power fairly quickly, 54-5. By 1955, you could say he's pretty much being able to speak together with Nikolai Bulganin, the military man, who was his sidekick in 55, but after that, not so much. He passed into the margins. We'll talk something about attempts to overthrow Khrushchev as we go along, but let's not get into that just yet. Khrushchev starts to think that the most important thing is to hook up with this Bandung bloc with third world nationalism, anti-imperialism. If you can do that, together with the Soviet Union, there will be a world peace bloc. Soviet Union and China, of course. There will be a world peace bloc. And so that's what he's aiming at. He wants to stay on good terms with Mao, and two of them were on good terms in 1956, 1957. They are going to be on good terms for several years from this point on. but they're going to be on bad terms just after that. Let's not talk about that just yet. But anyhow, they're all going along with this tendency. It looks like a considerable revolutionary bloc. And Khrushchev took Bulganin and went on a tour, went to India, you know, and you know, made a big tour. Stalin had never done anything like this, and he becomes a kind of a world statesman. He's in all the headlines, and there he is with Tito. So Stalin kicked Tito out of the Cominform in 1948. Tito's been an enemy. They've been denouncing Titoism, but Khrushchev is now playing ball with Tito. In fact, he had a conference with Tito in 1955. He said to him, gee, this was a mistake, he said, for you to have been expelled from the communist movement. And we're responsible for it, but really in the leadership it was Beria. So he named the police chief, Lavrenti Beria, as the real reason for the break with Tito. Tito said nonsense. We all know it wasn't Beria. No, and Beria couldn't have acted on his own. It was Stalin. He said Stalin was the one. So if you want to apologize to me for having kicked me out of the Cominform, if you want to patch things up, you'll have to come to grips with the fact that it was Stalin who did it. So Khrushchev gulped and swallowed that, but he wanted to destroy the Cold War. There he is, a Soviet cartoon, destroying the Cold War. That's Holodnaya Vojna on that hat. That is coming off the ice sculpture. So he starts to try to patch things up with Tito. And what was the result of that? Khrushchev's secret speech to the 20th Party Congress, January 1956, where Khrushchev takes up a very far-reaching, penetrating criticism of the Stalin tradition. It doesn't go all the way, not far enough to satisfy anybody in the West, not, in my opinion, not far enough to satisfy even a socialist in the West, but it's a big step. And he's criticizing Stalin. So he says there was a cult of the personality around Stalin. There was terror. People were unjustly accused of various things. Stalin made up lies. He liquidated innocent people. All this is true. Liquidated innocent people. Of course, he didn't go the whole route with it, but he did make a huge step, and it was enough for Tito. So from this point on, Soviets are not going to have big celebrations in the name of Stalin. They're going to de-emphasize Stalin, and they're going to be in a condition of de-Stalinization for some time. So that is a huge change for a country that lives by ideology. It's a revolutionary regime that lives by ideology. It is now criticizing Stalin. We're going to do this right up to the very end. And really, it will fall apart criticizing Stalin. And I'm going to have a lot to say about this before we're finished in this course, but I don't want to plunge into it just yet. The secret speech, 1956, though, very important benchmark for that process of de-Stalinization. But what effect did it have in the Soviet bloc? Immediately, the other Soviet regimes, Poles, Hungarians, started to make the argument that if we're going to criticize Stalin, it means we're going to have an entirely new regime here. I mean, most of these people in the leadership up till now have been on Stalin's bandwagon. If we're going to criticize Stalin, let's bring back different kind of leadership. In fact, let's have a different kind of regime altogether. So the de-Stalinization, while it doesn't introduce the question of democratizing the entire Soviet Union, it did not. It did raise that question in East Central Europe. And the result of it was that the communists in East Central Europe wanted to have a new kind of regime of reform communism, especially the Hungarians and the Poles. I would say the Poles first, under Władysław Gomulka, who Khrushchev is going to approve of. So Gomulka insists that the Soviets cannot control his affairs, Rokossovsky, a Soviet general, was their Minister of Defense, of all things. Imagine that. And Gomulka said, we have to get rid of Rokossovsky, and Khrushchev went along with that. Gomulka managed to satisfy him that he and the Poles were still loyal to the communist bloc, even though they wanted to run their own affairs. And Khrushchev thought that couldn't be disagreed with. It's a very interesting phenomenon going on here. So he had to put up with the Poles. It's different with the Hungarians. The Hungarians rose up and started to talk about changing things entirely. They revived the Smallholders Party. They renounced the leading role of the Communist Party. So that's a big step. That means that maybe the communists are going to yield power to a non-communist or anti-communist party. That means the whole country might change completely in a hurry. And they also said, did the Hungarians, that they were going to get out of this Warsaw Pact. So it's only a year old by this time, but they want to get out of it. So they're going to break with them militarily and politically. That's a much bigger step taken in Hungary than was taken in Poland. Khrushchev tried to talk them out of that, but in the end, he sent the tanks in after them. So he had to draw the line there. Interestingly, Tito was for the revival of Gomulka and the domesticization, you could call it, of Polish politics. But he was against the revolt against communism that took place in Hungary, and he supported the Soviet intervention against it in 1956. That's an interesting thing to note about Tito and Titoism, about which we will continue to say a good deal. The East Germans were afraid of this reconciliation with Tito, as you see. It's an East German cartoon, which says it has a picture of Tito with an axe. You know, he's a criminal. He's in the pay of the West. He's just a scoundrel. Everything bad you could possibly say about somebody. Because they're afraid that this reform thing is really going to get out of hand, and they'll be driven out of power as a result of it. So they see Tito and Titoism, reconciliation of Khrushchev with Titoism, and probably you would have to say de-Stalinization in general is a real threat to their existence. All right, but at the same time that these events were shaping up in Eastern Europe in the summer and fall of 1956, the whole question of the Mideast was hotting up as well. So the defiance of Egypt, defying the Baghdad Pact, caused the Baghdad Pact to more or less start to shape up as a kind of anti-Egyptian alliance, you could practically say. Certainly the British were scared to death of Nasser and began to think that Nasser represented something absolutely horrible, and began to make all kinds of strained arguments, ridiculous arguments, we have to say. Anthony Eden, who took over for Churchill, who retired in 1954, Anthony Eden came to the fore and started to say that Nasser was a Mussolini, a Hitler. You know, he had some experience with Mussolini and Hitler, so coming from him, it sounded authoritative, but still quite ridiculous to say this about Nasser. And he was just like Hitler, just to represent just as big a threat, and et cetera, and absolutely had to be stopped. Since then, almost everybody that we don't like, there's been a tendency for us to say that this person represents a new Hitler. And this is not a good tendency. I mean, that is to say, this is not a good tendency from the standpoint of speaking accurately about things and being sober about things. It's a kind of a tendency of trying to rile up people who don't know anything about the topic into a fighting mood. Not a good thing. Eden definitely fell into this. He wanted to get rid of Nasser. He thought Nasser was, in the end, a big threat to oil supplies in the middle. Not that Nasser had any oil, but he controlled the Suez Canal, through which all the oil comes. As you see from this German cartoon, all of it put very, very graphically. And not only John Bull in the United States, there's Uncle Sam, but a lot of other people, everybody who depends on oil that goes through the Suez Canal, is now at the mercy of Colonel Nasser. So they try to present Nasser such an enormous threat in this way. But the other mood that they seemed to take was that Nasser is, he's part of this third world bloc, and it represents a big part of humanity. And in the United States, Eisenhower and Dulles still recognized that they did not want to have the whole country, the whole war, the whole world against them. And maybe they could win Nasser over one way or another. When he started to depend on the Soviet Union, the United States started to increase its interest in him. And eventually, though, they lost the game because when Nasser bought all those Czech arms that we already talked about in 1955, he also decided to recognize China. And then the United States felt that had to be punished somehow. They were pretty adamant about nobody recognizing China. And so they dropped their support for the Aswan Dam. That was going to be the way the United States was going to compete for favor with the Soviets with all of their weapons. The United States was going to build them this dam that's going to change development in a serious way. The whole western part of Egypt, west of the Nile, could have been developed into agricultural communities and water power used in various ways that would have been very beneficial to the Egyptians. And this Aswan Dam, that was the big symbolic project in that endeavor. And then the United States, when Nasser recognized China, they very sharply withdrew the funding for the Aswan Dam. So that whole project, that whole thing, the dam didn't fall apart, but the whole relation with the United States totally went sour at that point. And the British and the French started to worry a lot about Nasser and started to criticize him in a serious way. Nasser responded by closing down the Suez Canal to them and by sticking a blockade of the Gulf of Aqaba. Keeps the Israelis from sending any ships out into the Red Sea. So the British and the French decided they had to do something about this. The fall of 1956, when the Hungarian and Polish events were coming to a head, Soviets were just on the verge of invading Hungary. The British and the French cooked up a plot in France with the Israelis. So Britain, France, and Israel. And the plot was the following. They were going to try to destroy Nasser's power and attack Egypt. The pretext was going to be that the Israelis and the Egyptians had too many border incidents across their Sinai border, and the Israelis got fed up and they were going to attack Egypt. And the British and the French, according to the scheme, were supposed to jump up suddenly and try to restrain Israel, restrain Egypt, and bring peace to the region. But of course, in the process of that, to land some troops. And in the end, somehow they were going to overthrow Nasser. That they got the upper hand militarily. So that was the way they were going to present the thing to the world. It was quite, how to put it, quite artificial. I'd say quite a cock and bull story that they were trying to put over on the whole world for this plot. It's kind of an interesting thing to see three nations come together, have a conference, and in a couple of days decide to make war on another country and decide to present it in this kind of artificial and false way. But that is what they were trying to do. The question was the United States going to go along with this? And they had every reason to think the United States was going to go along with it, certainly, because they didn't think the United States was crazy about Nasser after pulling out of the Aswan Dam project. And the United States had just got through overthrowing the Mossadegh regime in Iran, and similarly in Guatemala. So Nasser would have been the third. They would have pulled a Mossadegh on him, as some said. So the assumption was the United States would go along with this. And moreover, the United States was in the middle of an election campaign. Adlai Stevenson was running against Eisenhower. So it was thought the United States really wouldn't have much to say. And before you knew it, this thing could be done. And then maybe the United States wouldn't mind if this was done. They could act as if they didn't take a big part in it. That turned out to be wrong. It was a big miscalculation. Trying in effect to present the United States with a fait accompli on the issue of whether Nasser should rule Egypt. And then the other question was, how about the Soviets? They might stick up for Nasser, but they probably won't now because they're bogged down with this Polish and Hungarian affair. So, not while they're fighting over Hungary with tanks are they going to intervene in the attempt to save Nasser. So this is a really good time, thought the British and the French and the Israelis. This is really good time to attack Nasser, to try to pull this big coup off. So Anthony Eden is the main force behind it for the British, the main mover, the one who calls Nasser Hitler. And so they actually tried to do it in November of 1956. So the Israelis started the thing off on schedule, made their attack. They got over into the canal zone. The British got their paratroops, French paratroops. They also Israeli paratroops started landing in various places, and they're about to do the deed to Nasser. And suddenly, President Eisenhower stepped forward right in the middle of the election campaign, a week before the election, actually, and said that the United States was not for this, and that the British and the French must be crazy. And in a personal phone call, he shouted at Eden and said, "You must be crazy. We did not have this in mind, and you can't do this kind of thing. We will not support you." Okay, it's one thing to say that, but still more, the United States, it's now known pretty well, sold British currency, sterling, on the European money markets and caused a run in sterling. So that got the attention of the British in a big way, and the British had to back down. The Soviets did their part too. The Soviets said that if you don't leave Nasser alone, you have to remember that he might get on bad terms with us, and we have nuclear weapons, and we have some rockets. Well, they had intermediate range rockets capable of hitting London, however. So when the United States pulled the rug out from under this plot against Nasser, the Soviets did the same thing. You might have thought the United States and the Soviets really are marching down the same road. Why did the United States let their allies down? Didn't I just get through arguing that the Cold War meant a transformation of this paradigm of decolonization into the paradigm of anti-communism? Aren't the United States on the side of the colonial powers now and against these bumptious third world nationalists? Apparently not. Even John Foster Dulles. And of course, President Eisenhower, they're not willing to participate in this plot. It's too blatant, I guess. Too blatant. Not willing to do a Mossadegh on Nasser. And you could say that in this sense, together they saved Nasser. Many people who write on this take the view that it was the United States that did it. The Soviets were only a minor component part. But nobody who looked at it from any other perspective than the Western one in those days would have put it that way. They all saw the United States and the Soviet Union pretty much on the same page, and all trying to save Nasser. Well, in the end, Nasser was saved for the moment. This is a kind of a big moment for the United States. Maybe the United States takes the view that even if it's anti-communist, even if it's for containment, it can't be against the whole world. It can't be against Nasser and all the Bandung bloc, all the forces that Nasser represents. So it's kind of a really a big moment for the U.S. policy in that regard. A rather bad moment for Anthony Eden. He looks to be absolutely the loser in this proposition, as this cartoon seems to suggest. And that would be Eisenhower offering Eden's head on a platter to Nasser. And then, of course, a kind of a switch on the old idea of a sheep in, or a wolf in sheep's clothing. Here's Punch describing Anthony Eden as a sheep in wolf's clothing. He looks tough, he acts tough, he calls everybody Hitler, but in the end, he couldn't accomplish this feat. Okay, so there it is. Suez, an important moment. There are a lot of arguments about Suez. We'll talk about the fallout from Suez. It's kind of a big moment in our course. Because not only does it represent the moment when the United States broke with its allies to avoid this plot against Nasser, but it also represents a demonstration that these allies, who are the main imperial powers in the world, that they're sheep in wolf's clothing. And it's no accident that after this, there's a virtual jailbreak of every former colony that did not have its independence up to this time, associated with Britain and France, and this is going to include, all of them, the Belgians in the Congo and everybody else. They're all going to say they got their independence. It's all because of Suez. So Suez represents the big victory, gigantic victory in the Cold War of the Bandung Project, Third World revolutionary nationalism, anti-imperialist revolutionary nationalism. That's going to continue to have powerful ramifications as we march forward. So I'll take most of these up in due course and begin next time with a lot of fallout in 57, but things are going to change completely because the nuclear equation is going to change, and that's going to affect a lot of the important relations among the powers, especially between Russia and China. So those are topics we shall take up in our next batch of discussions, which will proceed soon.